All right, continuing our skimming of the surface in our survey of the Old Testament. I want you to be at least on a surface level familiar with these stories. We have finished up pre-Israel history in the first 11 chapters, and remember, the rest of the Old Testament, about 918 of the 929 chapters, is dedicated to information about Israel and God's relationship to Israel. You want to understand the past? Then you need to understand Israel. If you want to understand the future, guess what? You need to understand Israel, because the future is also about Israel and how we fit into that. You want to know what the Messiah is going to do, what God planned for him to do and to accomplish? Guess where you find that? In the Old Testament. And that's why I'm doing a survey of the Old Testament. As of late, in the pre-monarchy period, having finished up our discussion of the patriarchs, we have been looking at the Exodus. Last week we finished up the preparation for the Exodus out of Egypt. If you recall, God had made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give them a certain land that was inhabited by the Canaanites, which would later become the land of Israel. He made promises to them. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob believed God. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. He brought Israel's family down into Egypt, 75 of them, to grow them into a nation over a period of 430 years. And then, at this point in our story, he is taking that nation out. A nation is to be born by coming out of the womb of Egypt, which has caused it to grow. Then we looked at the plagues. How many of them? 10. 10 unbelievable judgments on the nation of Egypt because of the way that they had treated God's people, Israel, and because of their refusal to let them go. And just before the 10th plague, do you remember what the 10th plague is? God's judgment on the firstborn person of every family is the 10th plague. God instructs Moses, I want you to go tell the people to ask the Egyptians for gold and silver and clothing. Now, if the Chinese people existed in our country and all kinds of bad things happened to us because the Chinese people were living here, and the Chinese people came and asked you for gold and silver and clothing, what would you say? Get out of here. I'm sorry, that's Italian. But God moved in the hearts of the Egyptians, and they were predisposed to give the Israelite people gold, silver, and clothing. They did not come out empty-handed, and that's the plunder. And that happened just before the last of the judgments, the last of the 10 plagues. And God told everybody, I am taking the firstborn of every family. And you can avoid this through a sacrifice. You can avoid the judgment of God through a sacrifice. I want you to take a lamb, and I want you to take some of the blood, and I want you to sprinkle it over the doorposts, on the left and on the right, and over the top. And on the night when I come to take the firstborn, if I see the blood, and I know that there has been a sacrifice, then you can avoid judgment. And this is the message of what the Messiah would do when he came for us. The Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the earth. Paul says our Passover lamb has been sacrificed, delivering us from judgment. And when God saw the blood of Christ, we have been forever preserved from judgment. For without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Now, on that very night, Pharaoh, who is now absolutely defeated, calls Moses and Aaron and says, "Get out. Leave. Take your children, take your flocks, just go." That was the preparation of Israel for the exodus out of Egypt. But before we get into the preparation of Israel for the entrance into Canaan, we're actually going to talk a little bit about the 3 months of the trip out of Egypt. So starting next week, as we look at the preparation for the exodus into the land of Canaan, the land that God promised to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we're going to address that under 3 headings: the 10 Commandments, the tabernacle compound, and the temporary consequences for their failure to trust the Lord. Meanwhile, let's talk about the trip. There's that wonderful map again, and just by way of review. You see, up here in the northeast corner, the upper right-hand corner of your map, you see that land of Canaan up there. That's the land that was inhabited by the Canaanite people. We call that the land of Israel today, because Israel eventually came in under the Lord's power and drove the Canaanites out. And why did God want to drive the Canaanite people out? Because they were very, very wicked. These people worshiped their God by having sex. These people worshiped their God by sacrificing their children and tossing them in the fire. And God says, I want them destroyed. And I'm going to give you, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that land for a dwelling forever. Well, when Israel's family had become about 75 people, he brought them down into the land of Egypt because there was a great famine and he didn't want them to starve to death. And there, over a period of 400 years, they grew into about 2 or 3 million people. So that's how they got down there. And we have been going through the process of God preparing to bring that nation out of the land of Egypt. Where? To go back up to the land of Canaan. More about that in just a couple of minutes. Now, when God led them out of the land of Egypt, he went before them by day in a pillar of cloud. What is the closest that you have ever been to a tornado? Imagine right in front of the camp of the Israelites every day, a pillar of cloud, essentially a tornado. Every single day for 40 years, the Israelites saw this to lead them along the way in the day, and by night a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and that pillar of fire by night, and that must have been even more spectacular. Would you take the presence of God for granted? Would you not just come out of your tent every morning and just be in awe that God would have anything to do with you and would dwell in your midst and make his presence known to you in the pillar of cloud and in the pillar of fire? Did the Israelites do that? No. That it just became routine for them, and they didn't take it to heart at all. So, God wants them to go from Goshen, which is the part of Egypt that the Israelites settled in, because Pharaoh was so grateful for the people who had produced Joseph, the fella who had become prime minister and saved Egypt from dying in the famine, that he was willing to give Israel's family the best part of Egypt, which was Goshen. And now they've grown up there, and God wants them out. But instead of taking them northeast, right back up to the land of Canaan, he's got some other plans that he needs to do in the meantime. So he takes them down toward the Red Sea. And he has them camp there by the edge of the sea for a few days, and there's no problem, there's no worry. And all of a sudden, who shows up? The Egyptian army. And it strikes terror into the hearts of the Israelites who are watching the Egyptian army come toward them. And they can't go back to where they came because that's where the army's coming from. And they can't go forward because there's that sea. Now, let me explain a little rabbit trail here. You see the words Red Sea at the bottom? And then there's an inlet that comes up on the left side or the west side of the Sinai Peninsula. And then there's kind of an inlet that comes up on the east side of the Sinai Peninsula. We refer to those inlets, the one on the west as the Gulf of Suez, and the one on the east as the Gulf of Aqaba. But in those days, that was all just the Red Sea. Now, how do I know that Israel did not cross down near the bottom in the real wide part of the Red Sea? Well, I'll tell you why. Because at that point where you're looking right there, and that's not the widest point, that's about 175 to 180 miles across. And we know from the story that Israel made it across the Red Sea in one night. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I can't travel that far, even on bicycle, in one night, let alone on foot, with all of my sheep, my camels, my cattle, and all of the old people. So it makes sense to reason that probably up there, just about where the Suez Canal begins, which is a man-made structure, in the northern part of the Gulf of Suez is where they crossed. And that's where we find them in our story. So Moses stretched his hand out over that sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, made the sea dry land. Now, folks, when the Israelites stepped into the sea, did they step on mud? No, because that would have been icky, and it would have slowed them down. They stepped on dry land, and the waters were divided. The people of Israel went into the middle of the sea on dry ground, and the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and the wall to them on their left hand. And while I was there, I snapped a picture of the event, and you'll notice that Moses looks amazingly like Charlton Heston. But let's say that you're of the tribe of Judah, because the tribe of Judah always led the march of these 2 to 3 million Israelites. Let's say you're in the tribe of Judah, and you see this event, and you've got this huge wall of water on your left and this huge wall of water on your right. Who's going to be the first to go down in there? I don't know about you, but I would have been a little bit apprehensive. But nevertheless, they go on and they go through. And when the Egyptians, before that happens, did you notice in the story that God, who normally leads through that funnel of cloud, took his place behind the Israelites, and he got between the Israelites and the Egyptian army? You ever had anybody do that for you when you were a little kid? To protect you from a bully or something like that? Well, that's what God is doing with the Egyptian army. You're not coming anywhere near my people. And at a certain point, when Israel is across the Red Sea, God gets out of the way and says, have at it. And the Egyptian army goes down into where the Red Sea used to be. But for them, it's what? It's muddy. and their chariot wheels are getting bogged down and they're getting stuck. And all of a sudden they realize, ruh-roh, Scooby, we are in trouble. And sure enough, the waters came crashing down upon them, and that was the end of the Egyptian army. So, great rejoicing. Everybody's on a high for about 3 days. 3 days later, it starts. And folks, it never ends. Murmuring, complaining, grumbling, whining, whatever you want to call it. 3 days into the journey, the people are thirsty. And instead of crying out to the Lord, who do they cry out to? Moses. Did Moses create that situation? No, it's not Moses' fault. What are we going to drink? And they're at a place where there's plenty of water, but the water is very bitter and it doesn't taste good and it's not good for you. So God shows Moses a tree. He says, toss it in the water. Moses tosses it in the water, and all of a sudden, all the water in the area became drinkable. In fact, it was even sweet. God took care of the problem. Did they need to complain? Did they need to murmur? And they're murmuring not to Moses, they're murmuring against Moses. Is the COVID-19 virus Donald Trump's fault? Is he getting the blame? I didn't mean to insert that. Yes, I did. All right. So it's not long after that that the murmuring continues, and the whole congregation of the people of Israel murmured against Moses, and this time his brother Aaron is included. And they said to him, oh, that we had just died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, where we had pots full of meat, and we ate bread until we were full. Man, we had it so good back in Egypt. But you brought us out here into the wilderness to kill the entire assembly with hunger. The Lord is patient again, and he says to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. Now, does anybody remember what that bread is called? It's manna. And manna appeared on the ground every morning. God was faithful to provide for them until they actually got into the land that God promised to give to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. Now, it wasn't supposed to be 40 years, but it turned into 40 years, and God was faithful to provide for them. Did the Israelite people get it? No, because by the time Jesus comes on the scene, the leadership says, Moses gave the people manna to eat. And Jesus corrects them. It wasn't Moses. It was my Father. But I am the true bread that comes down from heaven. You see, God provides for us physically, but he also provides for us spiritually. And since the physical is just kind of temporary, which do you think is more important? The spiritual is for eternity. They're not done murmuring yet. They get to a certain place, and the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses. Boy, they've got short memories. Every time they have needed something, hasn't God been there for them? Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? You know, there are just some people that are just never going to be satisfied. They're never going to be patient to wait and see how a difficult, uncomfortable situation works out and what the Lord has planned for it. Nope. It's a McDonald's mentality. I want my burger and fries right now, and you better produce. But God says to Moses, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb." Horeb is another word for Sinai. "You shall strike the rock, and the water shall come out of it, that the people may drink." Now, I used to get this picture in my mind that Moses struck a rock and, a little fountain of water would come out. But remember, we're talking about between 2 and 4 million people that came out of the land of Egypt. So it probably looked something more like this. It was really a small river because you've got all those cattle and camels and sheep and people who need water. Now, Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, says, "Brothers, I want you to know that our fathers were all under the cloud." You know, the pillar of cloud? "And all passed through the sea. And all were initiated into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food," which was the manna, "and all drank from the same spiritual rock which followed them." And then he adds this, "and that rock was Christ." Don't ever forget where your provision comes from. It doesn't come from your father or your mother. It doesn't come from your government. And it doesn't come from your boss who signs your paycheck. Our provisions, physical and spiritual, come from the Lord. And Jesus said, "Whoever thirsts, let him come to me to drink. For he is the true satisfaction of all that we hunger and thirst for, and that better be righteousness." And he said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they, and they alone, shall be filled." All right. One more thing. Then came Amalek. See, they're a bit south of the Dead Sea, if you remember the map. And this is the area where the Amalekites, who come from Amalek, were settling. And they're a little bit territorial, and they're threatened by this huge mob of between 2 and 4 million people. And so they attack the people of Israel. And Joshua, who is the general, mowed down Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. But there's more to the story. Moses goes up on a hill to watch the battle. And he raises up his staff, and when he does, Joshua and the army of Israel prevail against the Amalekites. But when he gets tired and he drops it, the Amalekites begin to prevail. And so taking Hur, that's H-U-R, who is the leader of the tribe of Judah, and his brother Aaron up there with him, he sat down on a rock and they held his arms up so that at the end of the time, Joshua prevailed. So, let's review. God brings Israel out of Egypt. It ought to be presumed that God has good intentions for Israel, that he did not bring them out into the wilderness to die. He had made promises to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God did exactly what he said he was going to do. And not only that, he gives them a visible sign of his presence in the pillar of the cloud and in the pillar of fire. He is making his presence known to his people. Not only that, he has protected them. He has provided his presence. He has provided protection from two armies. He delivered them from the Egyptian army. He has now delivered them from the Amalekites, who are a much more numerous, battle-experienced, and very large people. And God has also provided for all of their physical needs, especially their hunger and their thirst. Why in the world would the people ever get the idea, after all that God has brought them out of the land of Egypt to die in the wilderness? And folks, when bad things, very, very bad things happen to you, has that ever occurred to you that God is about to destroy you? It has to me. All right. Now, I want to point out a certain incident that started at the beginning of their journey, but is going to be related to something that we're going to start next week. This is about the point where they get to the Red Sea, but they haven't crossed yet, and the Egyptian army has not caught up with them. Emotions are still high. Everybody's running on adrenaline. Yay, we're not in Egypt anymore. And he says, tell the people, this is God telling Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and to encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp over against it by the sea. And there they encamped for a few days. Let me see if I can tell you the significance of this. The Egyptians had their own group of gods. As you move north and east away from Egypt, the Canaanites and the people who lived on the Sinai Peninsula had another group of gods that they worshiped, and their chief was Baal. Baal means Lord. Zephon means north. And this is kind of a boundary point, which means when you move beyond this point, you're into the Lord of the North's territory. And Baal-zephon was a mountain that had shrines and altars and priests to Baal. And the Baal legend had it this, that when Baal descended out of the clouds onto the mountain, that the mountain would smoke because of fire, and there would be flashes of lightning and thunder, and there would be earthquakes. And God wanted them to encamp near the base of this mountain for a number of days to see Baal. And what do you suppose they saw? Nothing. Nothing. Why? Because Baal doesn't exist. And what he's saying to the nation of Israel, his people, you are going into Baal's territory, but you don't need to fear Baal. You don't need to fear the people that worship Baal. Baal cannot prevail against me any more than the gods of Egypt could prevail against me or prevent what I did to them in the 10 plagues. So you do not need to fear the Canaanites. So he moves them across the Red Sea, and on the 3rd new moon after the people of Israel had gone forth out of the land of Egypt, how long is that? That's at least 3 months, but not quite 4 months. On that day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai, and there Israel encamped before that mountain. Now, what is Mount Sinai? Sinai is the place where God is going to meet Israel. It's the place where, as we will discover next week, that God in his own voice shouted out, I am Yahweh, the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. And he verbalized the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And we'll take a look at that next week. So that's the Mount of God. And while they were there, what did they see? I'm really glad you asked. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet their God. And they took their stand at the foot of that mountain, and Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke, because the Lord had descended upon it in fire, and the smoke of it went up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. Who's real? Is it Yahweh or is it Baal? He is the only real God. All other gods are made-up gods, and they are imaginary, and you don't need to fear them. There was a similar contest a few centuries later when these prophets of Baal, only 450 of them, went up against one prophet of Yahweh whose name was Elijah, and Elijah proposed a contest. We're going to see who's really God, who's really Lord. I know that Baal means Lord, but he's really not Lord. And we're going to see if he's even real. Whichever God calls down fire on a sacrifice of a bull, he is Lord. And guess who showed up? Yahweh. Baal didn't show up. Our God is real. Now, that's a funny slide, isn't it? Bear with me a little foolishness. When I was 10 years old, on a Sunday morning, I rode my bicycle up to Main Street in Philmont. There's no traffic on a Sunday morning in Philmont, New York. This is a town that doesn't even have a traffic light, people. And Art's stationery store, where he sold newspapers and candy and other things, was always open because people stopped in to get the Sunday paper. Well, I was going up there because I wanted some caps for my cap gun. So I rode my bicycle up there. And I was very careful to look both ways before I crossed the street with my bicycle. And as I was riding across the street, I didn't notice that a fella ran out of Art's store. His car was still running because he was in a hurry. He didn't look both ways because he didn't need to, because there's no traffic on a Sunday morning. And he plowed into me, and I went right through his window. Fast forward 3 years. That's a 150-foot waterfall in our hometown. You see that rock formation on the right near the top? As a 13-year-old boy, I'm climbing on that. Why? Because I heard that there's a cave in there behind the water. Well, it was the spring of the year. I was alone, and I positioned myself on one of those rocks that was very, very slippery. And I was slipping to fall into the rocks below. Fast forward, I'm 19 years old. Our ship has just unloaded a bunch of us Marines on the island of Tinian. If that sounds familiar, it's where they loaded up the atomic bomb to drop on Hiroshima back in World War II. But we're just there for war games. On the way in, all we saw was sharks. People on the ships were taking out their guns and shooting sharks in the water, and it was a bloody shark fest. So we get all situated, and a friend of mine and I go down to the shore. We're not really going to go swimming, but we're just standing in water just a little bit above our knees, and both of us were swept off of our feet out to sea 100 yards by the most unbelievable riptide that I've ever experienced. Okay, so I finally make it back to the United States, and I get married, and I own a house, and I have raked up the lawn, and I have put the stuff I have raked up in my barbecue pit, and it's not lighting because it's moist, so I decide I'm going to throw some gasoline on it. Bright fellow that I was. And I had to roll on the ground to put out the fire. Fast forward a number of years. On October 11th, 1993, the doctor hauls me out of the waiting room at the hospital and takes me down to a room by ourselves and says, your wife is going to die of ovarian cancer. And for the next 9 months, I had the heartbreaking job of watching her decay into death. I can't tell you how many times that I have been broke, in debt that was unbelievable, lost a job in $3,000 to $4,000 worth of debt. I was borrowing from one credit card to pay another. I was not paying my rent. I was not paying mortgage payments. Why am I telling you all this stuff? Some of you have been through worse things than this. Some of you are facing worse things than this. Why didn't God keep me from all of these scary and painful events? Why didn't God keep Israel from all of these scary and painful events? Because they were opportunities for God to make his presence known and to say, I am with you always, and I will never depart from you. His opportunity to show the people of Israel, whatever your need is, I'm going to supply it. And whenever you need protection, I will give you protection. Also, when you get to the land of Canaan, you will remember all the things that I delivered you from, and you will have the courage to go in because you trust me, that my presence, my protection, and my provision will always be there for you. If God has a plan for you, he will provide for you. And hopefully, as you get older and you look back over the things in your life that the Lord has carried you through, you will remember that he has been faithful and trustworthy. And God is doing what is necessary to teach Israel to trust him. And God will take you through whatever it takes to teach you to trust him, so that you can sing Amazing Grace and say, through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. His grace has kept me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Do you trust him? Friends, it's about to get bad. The persecution of the church in this country was minimal. And now people are standing outside of churches, shouting and screaming, some throwing rocks into windows. It may come here to Birmingham, Alabama. Some Sunday morning, a rock may come flying through this window. Somebody may torch the building while we're in it. It could get really scary, people. How are you going to respond? Are you going to panic? Are you going to cry to the government and whine to the leadership like they did with Moses and Aaron? Or are you going to turn to the Lord? God is going to take you through whatever it takes to teach you to trust him. Friends, prepare yourselves. Prepare your expectations. It's going to escalate. We may end up not being able to meet in this building. We may have to meet together in homes, in secret. Are we going to be there for the Lord? Are we going to be there for one another? Prepare your hearts now. If God has a plan for us, God will have a provision for us. And as long as we're alive, I'm convinced he has work for us to do. And he will give us what we need to do that work as long as he wants us to do that work. Are you going to trust him? Or are you going to freak out and panic? Friends, you can't please God unless you trust him. Because without faith, it is impossible to please God. But the good news is, he's faithful. And he'll be there. And this is an opportunity for you as his children to shine. And this is an opportunity for him to shine as he displays his power in our weakness. Try to remember that. If you don't feel adequate for the job, that's exactly where he wants you to be. And as we're discovering in Romans, Israel was to be the light of the world so that Israel might be saved, yeah, but so that the Gentiles might know the God of Israel. Did Israel do that? But God used Israel to save Gentiles anyway by inflicting upon them severe punishment and discipline. And he cut those branches off so that we, the Gentiles, might be grafted in. See, God's going to get the work done one way or another. Israel could have enjoyed the blessing of God and just said, yep, we are going to be a light to the Gentiles. But instead, God withdrew the blessing of God from Israel in order to save Gentiles. Friends, let's be about the work that God wants us to be, of being a light to our community, to our friends, to the people in the grocery store, the gym, wherever we go, so that he doesn't have to do it through inflicting all kinds of nasty stuff on us.